Lawyers of Reddit. What case do you wish you never won? Story 1. Right before taking my bar exam in Germany, I was working in a small law firm as a law apprentice. There was one case which was given to me because it was considered unwinnable, but the client insisted on pushing through. The case was about an elderly lady who sold her cat because she was too sick to take care of her. The buyer of the cat, our client, a rather wealthy lady, took the cat to the vet right after buying it. Apparently, the cat needed €2,000 worth of surgeries. She hired us to collect those €2,000 from the old lady. She was really an unpleasant woman to say the least. She acted without even the slightest bit of remorse or empathy. She knew exactly in what situation the old lady was, because she was the one who informed us about it. Nevertheless, we won the case pretty quickly, even though our client didn't have a leg to stand on. Comment 1. I am pretty sure that both had a lawyer. For most cases there is something called Anwaltspflicht, which means you have to have a lawyer. There are exceptions to this, but I guess if it involves €2,000 you probably need a lawyer. Don't quote me on this though. I got sued in Germany for €3,500 once. I ignored all the letters from the opposing lawyer because it was a ridiculous charge. Got a letter from court saying something along the lines of, if you don't pay or settle this out of court there will be a court date. I showed up to the court date without a lawyer because, again, I thought this thing was stupid. There was a random lawyer around from the previous case who heard that I didn't have a lawyer. I showed him the paperwork, and he told me if I hired him, he would get this thing thrown out and the other side would have to pay for his services. He got the case thrown out within 5 minutes. I would not have needed a lawyer for that, but he managed to also get it in writing that further claims it was a health issue, could not be made and that I could not be sued for future damages that might occur. The opposing side had to pay me a little bit of money for needlessly inconveniencing me. I would not have gotten that without a lawyer. So, the rule is probably there for a reason, I guess. Comment 2. I'm only a law student and not in Germany but in a neighboring country, so take anything I'm about to say with a serious grain of salt. If the laws in Germany are similar to those in mine, you don't need to have specified that it's a healthy cat. We assume it is a healthy animal unless you tell us otherwise. Good old Christian tradition has mixed with the laws there. The only thing you can be sued for is when you knowingly sell a sick animal without informing the buyer of the sickness. You never have to prove it's a healthy animal. We assume it is if you do not tell us otherwise. In other words, no obligation to sell a healthy animal, only an obligation to inform the buyer if the bought item isn't as healthy, perfectly working, or exactly what you'd reasonably expect from it. Again, I'm just a law student and don't know anything about German law, so I have no idea whether it's the same in this case or not. I'm only giving my, right now, very limited knowledge. Story 2. Not a lawyer, but when I was a paralegal, my boss got a registered offender acquitted of the most serious charge of first-degree assault. We had a confession he had given to our firm's hired psychiatrist locked in my boss's desk drawer. During the trial, the lawyer had me, at the time a woman in my 20s, sit directly beside the defendant so the jury could see I wasn't afraid of him. He insisted on taking the stand. During his testimony, I casually turned around to look at his wife. On her face was etched a look of horror. She, who knew him best, could tell he was lying. Up to that point, I guess she had believed his story that the teenage employee was just after his money. I felt so gross after that and switched to a real estate and refinance law firm. Comment 1. I'm surprised they haven't made a movie about the case of Alton Logan. Summary. Mr. Logan was arrested for the harm of a security guard at a nearby fast food restaurant. All throughout his trial, Mr. Logan maintained his innocence. Meanwhile, prisoner Andrew Wilson, serving a life sentence for the harm of 2 police officers, confessed to his own attorneys, Dale Coventry and Jamie Kunz, that he had committed the harm that Mr. Logan was being tried for. Mr. Wilson seemed to take pleasure in the fact that someone else might be punished for a crime that he had committed. He absolutely refused to come forward with this information. The attorneys eventually convinced Mr. Wilson to agree that his confession could be released upon his death. Since the person responsible was their client, the attorneys had little choice but to remain silent. The law on attorney-client privilege is quite clear here, not morally but legally. Had the attorneys come forward with their client's confession against that client's will, they not only would have been disbarred, but that evidence would likely have been suppressed as a matter of law. Mr. Logan was wrongfully found guilty. He then proceeded to sentencing, which was between a life sentence and the death penalty. The attorneys attended and watched as an innocent man was almost sentenced to death for a crime they knew he didn't commit. They claim in their 60 Minutes interview to have made a pact that if he had been sentenced to death, they would have come forward anyway, even though it likely would not have made a difference. Ultimately, Mr. Logan was sentenced to life and spent 26 years in jail until Mr. Wilson died and the attorneys were able to come forward with the exonerating evidence. This situation is extremely divisive even within the legal community. It's a case where morality doesn't line up with the law, and the attorneys made a decision that many still don't agree with to this day. Story 3: I used to prosecute neglect cases in a large city in America for child protection services. After a few high-profile cases where young kids ended up losing their lives at the hands of family members, child protection services started asking us to file on pretty much everybody. I understand why, but I wish they would have stood up to the bad press instead of allowing it to dictate who they brought to court. From that point on, I would say about half my cases, even though a cause of action existed, I felt guilty for winning. Story 4: I was a labor lawyer for some time, and we had a no-exception policy against using the company credit card for personal expenses. Everyone knew you would get fired for it because they constantly emphasized it with frequent training, mandatory signatures, and so on. We fired a guy who was just a few months from retirement, and his union filed for arbitration. Arbitration is often considered a joke, and any labor lawyer will tell you that no arbitrator would uphold that termination even if the guy wasn't near retirement. We won. Due to the way the pension worked, the fact that he left before he reached 55 led to a massive pension discount, hundreds of thousands of dollars lost. Oh, and by the way, his offense was filling up his car with gas using the company card because he had left his personal card somewhere and was about to run out of gas. On the other hand, I had many employees do extreme things like hide and sleep at work for 40 hours, cause a 30,000-gallon gasoline spill, engage in fights, make threats, and so on, who all got their jobs back through arbitration. Story 5: I had a misdemeanor stalking case once. My client wanted a jury trial, so we did that, and I had to question the poor woman who was being harassed by this guy. The jury came back with a "not guilty" verdict, and my client turned to me and said incredulously, "They found me not guilty?" Yeah, that case. Comment 1: I had a misdemeanor stalking case once. My client wanted a jury trial, so we did that, and I had to question the poor woman who was being harassed by this guy. The jury came back with a "not guilty" verdict, and my client turned to me and said incredulously, "They found me not guilty?" Yeah, that case. Comment 2: pretty much every woman I know who was assaulted in a nonviolent situation. They were all mostly guilted or pressured into it, too inebriated to consent, or were threatened with some kind of social blackmail. It's honestly disturbing how few people seem to actually understand consent. I think a lot of media put it in people's heads that assault is this overly violent crime, but from most of the stories I've heard, it isn't. Comment 3: blackmail was a childhood trauma similar to what was about to happen to me. I didn't want people at school to know about the inappropriate touching because it was a family member. That's how I lost my virginity. I told the police and my mom. The police said I didn't show enough emotion, so they didn't believe me. Comment 4: yes, all the older people, half our grand jury, believed that if violence wasn't involved, then you made the choice to go along with it. It was awful. This case was one of our last ones out of over 200 cases we heard. It caused a huge rift between a third of us who were younger and the other 2/3 who insisted it wasn't assault. We were all a jury that got along well and joked together before that. After that case, we couldn't really chit-chat together as much because tempers flared on that case. It was intense. Those shouting scenes in movies between jurors? That happened between me and an older man. A woman, who was allowed to stay with us to keep the peace, made us stop for the day and come back another day. I did what I could to convince the others, but I just couldn't do it. That is the case that's going to haunt me. There were some really messed up cases we heard, but I followed those, and at the full trial, all the others except this one case got guilty verdicts. Even though the other stories will stay with me, I can feel a little better that I helped put them away. With this case, though, I will always remember the faces of the people who let this guy get away with it. We all agreed that there was enough proof to show what happened. We all just disagreed on whether it was considered assault. He would have been found guilty if people had followed the definition of consent. I will remember that case forever. For the record, the assistant district attorney sitting in the discussion and asking the detective questions was flat out saying that coercion counted. We only had to vote on whether the proof was there, not whether that proof counted beyond a reasonable doubt. They agreed the proof was there but refused to vote to go to trial because they didn't want it to count. The district attorney had to toss our case out because people refused to vote. They were refusing to adhere to the definitions provided by the district attorney. Story 6. I used to handle divorces, mostly. I'm not cut out for that work, but it was the job I could get out of law school. A guy came in for a divorce and seemed, by all accounts, really nice. He claimed that they had $50,000 in cash in their safe and that his wife had taken it out when she left the house. His ex-wife never worked, so it seemed reasonable that she would take the money to help pay bills, start over, and so on. 6 months in though, when we were finalizing property, his true colors started to show. He refused to let her have the toaster, argued over giving her anything even though she hadn't worked their entire 15-year marriage, and told her she could have half of the expensive plants she tended to only if she came and got them herself without help. For reference, these plants were in a greenhouse, and some weighed upwards of 100 pounds each. She probably weighed 100 pounds herself, an extremely meek woman in her 60s. The other lawyer and I finally got everything settled except the $50,000. My client said she took it. His ex-wife said she did initially but then put it back on the advice of her attorney. So we went to trial just on this $50,000. I cross-examined her elderly parents, treated them as hostile witnesses, and really went all out. Up against a veteran attorney who had been doing this for over 30 years while I was brand new. I had to prove myself. In the end, the judge ended up declaring that the $50,000 was lost money. No one, technically, won. 1 hour later, my client waltzed into the office and paid his $15,000 bill, all in $100 bills. I just stared silently at the money while he smiled widely at me, thanked me for helping him, and then left. I quit practicing law entirely 3 months later. I still think about his ex-wife, who honestly seems sweet and lovely, and I hope she's okay. Story 7. We took a copyright case to trial twice, and then an appeal, and won every time. The case was on contingency, meaning the client doesn't pay unless you win. We have spent years trying to collect the judgment from the defendant so we can get paid. We have a judgment for our own fees that is close to $1 million, throwing good money after bad. The defendant hid his assets very effectively, put all hard assets into limited liability companies, got paid hundreds of thousands a year in cash and services to avoid banks, and so on. He passed away from COVID-19 on a Friday, and was likely savvy enough to avoid probate. All of this is a gross oversimplification, but the short version is we won a case 3 times and have never been paid a cent because the defendant was very shady and passed away, so we will likely get nothing for the client or ourselves. Story 8. I always thought it would be cool to be a lawyer until I had to pay $63,000 in attorney fees over the course of 2 years for custody of my daughter. Now, I'm not complaining so much about the money, more so about watching her attorney try to turn a bad case into a good one, no matter how irrefutable the evidence against her was. I wouldn't be able to live with myself or sleep at night defending cases like that, where I would potentially be trying to return children to situations involving substances, abuse, neglect, and so on. Comment 1 for context. I'll be an attorney in about a month when I graduate. During my schooling, I've worked at a family law firm, personal injury law firms, and the court, where I saw some civil and criminal matters. I'll tell you now, family law is a whole different beast that I won't touch with a 10-foot pole. Half the time you take on these clients when you only hear their side of the story, and then the bad things only come out halfway through, and you can't get out of the case. You have to ask the court to get out of a case if you're already representing them. It's fairly often granted, but it can be denied. Plus, even if the attorney wants out, they can't just abandon the client or they can be sued for malpractice. All in all, I would never do it because of the kind of situations involved, but I'm sure there are a lot of family law attorneys who feel just as bad about those things but had no choice at the time. Comment 2. I felt bad for my husband's ex's attorney. She is a real piece of work and ended up losing almost all custody. She has the very minimal custody given to parents who aren't in jail or involved in serious offenses. But it was extremely clear when I was on the stand that she had lied through her teeth to her lawyer when I answered all her questions about abuse and such in stride. My husband is kind of a rough around the edges military veteran who is struggling his way through veterans affairs in school, but I'm an educated mechanical engineer, clean cut, and truly love my now husband and stepson. We read him books and tuck him in every night, talk with him about his emotions, feed him good food, and so on. My husband's ex is a low-effort con artist. She does whatever she can to get out of even basic responsibilities. She now lives 1,000 miles away. Story 9. Client hired information technology consultants from another consulting firm. The firm basically found qualified people and rented them out, sort of like a recruiter, but they get fees indefinitely, common in information technology consulting. The client eventually thought he was paying too much, even though he had agreed to it, and stopped paying. He owed $200,000. In New Jersey, you need to be licensed as a consulting firm. If you're not, you can't sue for your unpaid bills. They sued anyway, trying to argue some loopholes. We won, and the client paid nothing beyond my legal fees. Was I happy I won? Not really. It gave me a great story, great for my reputation. Doesn't feel great helping out an unpleasant person though. I was an underling who had no role in being able to reject the case, so that was a bit of a consolation at least. Story 10. I was representing a homeless man whom the government was trying to get custody over so they could force him into rehabilitation. It was a bit rare since the government rarely bothers due to the high expenses. You need medical reviews, it has to go before a judge, and the defendant must be provided with a lawyer. Plus, there are low odds of success since no one likes the idea of forced institutionalization. In this case, the man was exposing himself outside windows and stealing packages. The former, more than the latter, had gotten a critical mass of neighbors to push the city to actually try for custody. It was a pretty easy win due to the very high bar to actually get someone placed beyond a short-term mental health hold. In all honesty, I felt like the city wasn't trying that hard, more like going through the motions so they could tell voters, we tried. It did not feel great looking at all the folks who had packed into the courtroom as they realized the man was not going to be forced into rehabilitation and would instead be right back outside their windows. But it got worse. The homeless man went on a victory lap of exposing himself. Local police were called during the part of the victory lap where he was outside the window of a minor, and a frustrated father physically attacked the homeless man. The homeless man later prevailed in a civil suit for damages against the father who assaulted him, in a case I was not involved in. He used the money to buy substances and was later killed while wandering around a freeway ramp under the influence. Long story short, if I had lost, in the following 6 months one man wouldn't have had to take a plea deal for the attack. 2 poor men coming home late from a landscaping job wouldn't have had to deal with the trauma of running over a man, and the homeless man would have been getting clean instead of ending up in a fatal accident. Also, I was very annoyed that the district attorney never just charged him on the indecent exposure issues, put him up on that, then offer a plea deal with rehabilitation instead of jail time. The whole approach by various city officials just reeked of, don't really want to win, but can't appear like we aren't doing anything because the primary election is in 8 months. Story 11. When I was an insurance defense attorney, there was a man who sued one of my clients after she hit his car and caused a neck injury. He was legitimately injured badly enough that he couldn't do his job anymore. I had to defend her, and I did a good job from her and her insurance company's perspective, and all he got was his past medical bills. The jury should have given him a lot more than that, and I have felt bad about that for years. Story 12. An undocumented immigrant had been hired by a farm, and then the farm refused to pay him. When he demanded his payment, the farmer reported him to immigration authorities. Since it was the second time that farmer had turned him in, it was considered unauthorized re-entry, a felony. The prosecutors really didn't want to go after the man. It would have been terrible press. However, there was an immigration agent waiting right outside the courthouse. We thought that maybe if the man served a couple of months of jail time, the immigration authorities would forget about him once he was released, and in the meantime we could go after the farmer to get his payment. Ultimately, We decided that we were criminal defense attorneys, not immigration lawyers or business lawyers, and we couldn't ethically allow a man to go to jail if we could get him out of it. We filed a motion to dismiss on procedural grounds. The prosecution didn't oppose, and the man was promptly detained by immigration authorities, deported, never received his money, and could never return to the United States again. Story 13. Not a lawyer. I'm a paralegal who worked in insurance defense. One of our cases was trying to get the lowest possible amount for a man who, while doing his job in a stationary car, was hit from behind at full speed. His car was off the road, and the other driver was impaired. His car was slammed into the large truck he was assisting with. He is now permanently disabled and living in a care home, and our job was to get him far less than he deserved. I didn't want to work in insurance defense anymore after that case. Story 14. I knew someone who was a defense attorney in Florida with a great record. He was defending a teacher accused of serious misconduct. During the testimony of the key witness, he realized his client was guilty and was excited by the testimony. After a recess, he still went in and gave a harsh cross-examination, destroyed the victim's credibility, and secured a not guilty verdict. Winning this case led him to be recruited by a major law firm in New York City that offered him a significant salary. It turned into a nightmare. His wife ended up committed to a psychiatric institution, and his boss was described as an extremely difficult person to work for. Story 15. None of them. I want to win. I knew though that I'd have a tougher time not being emotionally engaged with family law, criminal cases, and anything else really emotional, so I forged a career where it's companies and money at stake. Now I work in-house as a litigator for a multinational corporation covering disputes throughout the world. I always do make sure that if we're thinking of litigating in a country with unusual laws, the penalties aren't inhumane. I have no interest in someone being subjected to extreme punishment for messing with the company. Story 16. I represented a foreign medical company that has a worldwide monopoly in the treatment for a specific kind of cancer. They used to sell these treatments to hospitals and other public organizations. They had a dispute with buyers about the price of the treatment. They wanted to be paid far more than the price set by the hospitals. So, they decided to fake a shortage of some of the components needed and stopped producing the product worldwide, leaving many patients without access to treatment. After some time, they resumed production once their price demands were met. They faced both criminal and civil consequences, but in the end, I managed to reduce their responsibility to just a small economic fine, less than 0.001% of the profit they made from this entire operation. Comment 1. Call me harsh, but that's what happens when you want private companies to develop and produce things instead of doing it yourself, and then try to force them to sell it at low prices. Forced supply at below market prices is basically like someone forcing you to hand over your phone at knife point, but they give you $1, so technically you sold it. Story 17. In college, a woman came to my multicultural class to talk about being a lawyer. Her big case, the one that made her career, was defending a multi-million-dollar condominium building that had a security issue. Some individuals got in and assaulted and held a woman captive for a few days. She basically spun it like the woman was into extreme intimacy, and the condominium building won. It was the last case she took in the private sector. She started doing pro bono and public defense work afterward. She hated what she had done and felt she needed to make amends with society. Listening to her talk about all the unpleasant things she had done made me realize that if you ever have to deal with anything legal, get an attorney. Never face another attorney on your own. Story 18. Mandatory. Not a lawyer. Disclaimer, but here's a story my history teacher told me. His father was a lawyer. Warning. This story is graphic and may be disturbing for some readers. An elderly woman was harmed and killed, and her purse was stolen. At the top of the list of suspects was a man with a criminal record. 2 police officers, without a warrant, entered this man's house, found the purse, and arrested him. The lawyer, fresh out of law school, was assigned by the state to defend this man. When he asked the man whether he had actually committed the crime during private lawyer-client conversations, the man avoided the question and wouldn't say. On the day of the trial, the lawyer showed up and won the case by having the evidence thrown out since it was obtained without a warrant. Without evidence, there was no case, and the man was found not guilty. As the man walked out of the courtroom, he turned to the lawyer, held out his hand, and said, "Thank you, I did it." The lawyer immediately felt sick and walked away quickly. He quit criminal law the next day, but it didn't end there. Over a decade later, while watching the news, the lawyer saw that the same man had been killed in a shootout with police. He had broken into a family's home, and not only was he killed, but he also harmed the entire family. The lawyer broke down in tears and had to explain to his children why he believed it was his fault those people were gone. He thought that if he hadn't defended that man, those later events may never have happened. This happened in Pennsylvania, as far as I know. The first crime occurred in the 1950s or 1960s, and the man was killed in the 1980s. Story 19. The cases are confidential, so I can't share details, but about half of the modifications to parenting plans involved two vindictive people going back and forth against each other, and the children suffered as a result. Comment 1. I hear you. Because of the way my ex is handling things, it's forcing me to be vindictive too. Not looking for advice, just sharing my story here. For the last decade, I had been extremely flexible. We had the agreement, but I would always bend in the interest of keeping the peace. You think it's going to be your grandmother's last Thanksgiving? Fine, you can take the child, even though this is the third year in a row pulling this same move. You made plans to take a trip even though I had one planned for months? Fine, I didn't want to argue. All said and done, what she was pulling was classic manipulation. Thanksgiving rolled around last year, so I made sure to get my plans in well in advance. So far in advance that I brought it up before Thanksgiving of the previous year. The week before, she texted me claiming it was her year. I put my foot down, threatened to involve law enforcement, and scaled back my plans. She then said, "Well, I'm doing you a favor here, so I'll give you one day." The following week, I was served with modification papers. The modification she wanted was not what the child wanted, it was what she wanted. I sat down with my child and talked about most of the points. No issues at all. So now I'm forced to get an attorney, and the only way to survive this is to get detailed and, frankly, a bit vindictive to protect the well-being of my child. Story 20. Personal feelings or opinions have no place when the case is actually being handled. We signed up to be professionals in the justice system. That is exactly why we must remain objective and leave our personal feelings out of it. Yes, behind the scenes, we all have our opinions about clients, whether positive or negative. But when it comes to actually conducting the case, we separate this very clearly. It seems the original poster is somewhat hinting at criminal cases, like helping someone with extremely serious charges. Many of us handle other matters and may not even litigate. Many cases also settle before going to court. Story 21. There was this guy who just had a certain vibe, like someone who would wear designer clothes while acting erratically. He was the worst driver I had ever seen. He constantly got into accidents, went off-road into fences for no reason, and had only had his license for a year, yet he was already a point or two away from having it suspended. This ticket would have pushed him over the top. I managed to get him no points on his license. I assumed the prosecutor just didn't look at his driving record because, honestly, he was a menace behind the wheel. Not the most exciting story, but it's the only case where I regret getting a positive result. Story 22. I know a guy who worked as a public defender in the United States after just passing the bar. He was assigned a client who constantly abused his child. The client ended up in jail after a particularly serious incident, but Child Protective Services filled out the paperwork incorrectly. This lawyer noticed the mistake, and the abusive father was able to get released and regain custody of his child. It was very sad. Story 23. I was assigned to do our firm's public defender volunteer work and got sent to a rural community to handle cases for the evening. All easy stuff. Traffic tickets, some minor offenses, and so on, until I got to one public intoxication and driving under the influence case. I got his case, read his history, and saw that he had never taken advantage of a program that allowed the court to delay sentencing if he agreed to counseling and stayed clean for a certain period of time. I can't remember exactly how long, maybe 6 months or so. So, I got him to agree to the program, worked with the prosecutor, the judge agreed. His license was suspended, but his sentence of 90 days was stayed pending the outcome of his counseling and clean record. He was ecstatic, I was pleased with my cleverness, and we all went home happy. I got a call from the prosecutor the next morning. My client was in the morgue. He had been so happy with my work that he went out, got drunk, passed out along one of the back roads, and got himself run over. The only silver lining was that he couldn't drive and harm anyone else, but the man who ran him over was devastated. His wife and son were devastated. They all blamed me. They believed that if I had let them send him to jail, he would still be alive. I stopped practicing law not long after that. It's been about 10 years, and I have never regretted leaving it behind. Story 24. You were trying to get your client to stay clean and get counseling. Your client decided to get heavily intoxicated yet again. It's not your fault that he got run over or that the man who hit him was traumatized. It was your client's fault. Suppose your client had gone to jail for 90 days. He likely would have gotten drunk as soon as he got out and might have passed out on a road and gotten killed 90 days later, or maybe he would have driven and hurt a pedestrian. Would you have blamed yourself for that too? People make terrible decisions when they have an addiction problem. That's not on you. Story 25. Not my case, but a friend's. It was a child custody case. The woman was suing her ex-boyfriend for full custody. He wasn't allowed to abandon the case because of the legal system's requirements. Basically, she was pressing with some evidence that he had assaulted her. He was her lawyer in that case. However, it turned out that the marks she claimed were caused by him were actually makeup. He still won the case, but he felt really bad afterward. I don't think I've ever seen him get that intoxicated after work before. Story 26. I was arrested for hitting my son's father. Yes, I was young and had a good reason, but no, I should not have hit him. He did the whole, "You're not faithful, it's not my baby, it could belong to anyone in town," routine. My son is his exact look-alike and has been since birth. I finally got sick of it and punched him hard one night. He pressed charges. My uncle, Harold, told my dad that he'd make a call and the charges would disappear. My dad wouldn't allow that. He said I needed to be responsible for my actions. I appreciate that now, though I certainly didn't back then. When we went to court, the judge called my name, and when he called my son's father, he accidentally called him Michelle instead of Michael. When Michael stood up and corrected him, the judge laughed out loud. He couldn't hide it. The judge asked him, "You pressed charges on a girl for hitting you?" Really? Needless to say, the charge was dropped down to disorderly conduct. Michael was furious when we left court. Everyone in the courtroom was laughing. I know how to act like butter wouldn't melt in my mouth. The judge believed every word I said. Men, if your partner is pregnant, please don't act like that. Even if you have doubts, be there for the pregnancy. You can have a DNA test when the baby is born, but you can't get back all that time and those memories. Oh, and ladies, if you're not sure who the father of your child is, be honest with the men in your life. It's fine to have intimacy with whoever you want, but your children don't get a say in that situation, so please be responsible for them. Children need two parents. The best birth control I've ever found is this. Before you have intimacy with someone, stop and think about everything they've ever done that you know about. Is this the person you want to raise a child with? Really? It works for both men and women. It's foolproof, too. Story 27. Obligatory. Not a lawyer. Disclaimer, but I'm sure my brother's lawyer, and probably my brother himself, wishes she didn't win a previous assault case where the client got a suspended sentence instead of a harsher charge. Later on, that same client ended up taking someone's life. Story 28. Here's an interesting story. Hillary Clinton once defended a man accused of serious misconduct when she was a lawyer. Evidence was thrown out because the forensic experts lost it. The victim suffered permanent physical consequences. The man got a significantly reduced sentence. Does she wish she had done differently? I doubt it. Both she and her husband later became associated with highly controversial figures. Story 29. Lawyers don't always get to choose their clients and have to do what their client wishes. They can only refuse services for a very narrow set of reasons, such as frivolous claims or inability to pay. Personal injury claims rarely meet the legal definition of frivolous. If someone gets hurt by another, there's a plausible chance of winning, however remote. I don't know about Germany specifically, but many personal injury claims are done on contingency, meaning the lawyer only gets paid if the client wins. Thus, for that reckless person, there was almost nothing to lose. Worst case, he goes to court and loses. Best case, he gets his medical bills covered, among other things. Again, I don't know if medical bills are applicable in Germany. Little did he know that he would end up paying the other side's legal fees.